hopscotch, and in it there's a group called the Serpent Club, and I always thought it was a really cool name. I always wanted to be part of the Serpent Club.
Yeah.
That's a really fun book because it's not. Do you know this one? Do you know Cortazar's Hopscotch? It's so great. It's I have a copy at my house if I haven't seen it or something. But it's a book where you can read it, and then it's like a choose your own adventure where you can read one page to the next, or at different points it'll say jump to page 71. And then you can read from there and keep going straight. And you can optionally jump, or if you're enjoying what you're reading, you just keep going. So it's a really nice sacral response book for us sacral people out there. Maybe for the emotional, it might take a year to get through. Do I want to know what happens in the story yet, or do I want to jump? I can't. Maybe it's great. It's great for the manifestors. They're just like, screw this. I'm just going to go right to the end. They just tear it up. It's a great book. It's a great book. All right. So the topic today is Jung, the complexes and the not self, and I am joined by Montoya. So Jung, the complexes and the not self. And the idea behind this was, Jenny said, you're always talking about Jung, you're always telling me about Jung, you're telling me all about the complexes, you always, you never do any content on that. And I said, well, it's a human design thing, I don't know if people, but I mean, Jung is kind of human design adjacent, kind of proto-human design, but then Jungians now are not human design at all. That's what's sad is that, any mutation, in fact, this is a great way to start. Jung's favorite myth. Did I see Mike? Do you know Jung's favorite myth, Mike?
No, what is it?
Would you tell us now? The water, the underground water. You know this, right?
I don't. No.
Oh, okay, really? Well, it's an ancient myth, and it's actually kind of a universal myth. I don't know which culture to credit it with, maybe the Mesopotamians, but there's essentially this underground water that comes up from the soil. And it's the water of life. And it's the healing waters, and it's the waters that give life to everything and create all of life. And the humans gather around it, and they gather around this creative spark, and they celebrate it, and then pretty soon they start to create rituals and codes, and pretty soon it dries up, but nobody notices. And they continue doing all these rituals, but it's completely dried up, and the water's gone somewhere else. This underground stream has moved on, and it's appeared somewhere else, but nobody notices it there, because they're all so wrapped up where it no longer exists. And this was Jung's favorite myth. This was why he said, God isn't dead, we have just lost our symbol for him. It was this kind of male anthropomorphized version of God. But what he was talking about was the connection to the numinous, to the unconscious, to the mysteries, to the sacred, to the divine, all of that. So really, when we're bringing in Jung into the conversation, and his sort of view was that he even said at his 80th birthday, "Thank God I am Jung and not a Jungian," because he saw already the ossified that his life force had sapped, in that the water, his aqua vitae, his water of life was no longer flowing as it was, and that already people were then taking those Jungian statements and turning them into other things. We see it in human design all the time. People are taking it and turning it into something else. And of course, that's mutation on the one hand, but it can also be ossification. It can be like anti-mutation. It can be freezing. It can be when you're melancholic and find a reason, and suddenly it freezes into depression. And you don't need that reason. That would have kept it mutative, kept it living, kept it moving, but it froze it into something else. Similarly, Lacan, the great French psychoanalyst, had, and kind of enemy of Jung's, had a really interesting perception, which was that the moment that somebody has a realization, there's a really crucial moment in that epiphany that has to be protected from the collapse of the waveform function, so to speak, of turning it into a new defense mechanism. That he said, essentially, they have such a strong defense against the new information. Then the moment the defense breaks down, the new information comes in, that becomes the new defense. And so they come to you and they say, I have a perfect family, I'm so lucky, my family had no problems. And then you show them the family dysfunction. The moment that happens, they suddenly say, I came from a dysfunctional family, and this is their new weapon. And you don't know what it's like to come from a dysfunctional family. You don't know what it's like.
It's remember that guy?
Yeah. It's sort of a turning everything on its side, truth. Yeah. I had a friend who had a psychedelic experience where he was experiencing truth as vertical, and he had this shamanic guy who kept coming to him and looking him in the eyes and turning like this, and he would experience it as, whenever the guy would do that, he could no longer grasp it. It was like truth was almost ungraspable, because the grasping was a fraction of the truth, but not the whole thing. It was turning it into some belief that he then had to fight for, or even die for. And it was about the truth doesn't need you to fight for it. The real truth doesn't. It's just there. It's got mystical. It's a very mystical conversation. So it's because he's sitting next to me. He has a divine Ajna. I'm telling you what he's thinking about. This is just happened to take out his mind. Okay, so the topic though, so back to the topic, is kind of Jung and the complexes. So Jung actually called what is now known as depth psychology or Jungian psychology, also archetypal psychology, although James Hillman kind of took that moniker. But what is known by these names was originally known as complex psychology. And Jung coined the term complexes. And in coining the complexes, what he meant was autonomous aspects of ourselves we weren't really aware of that had their own personalities, their own, there's a great, are there any fans of Mr. Show with Bob and Dave? Bob Odenkirk and Dave Cross, older show, but Bob Odenkirk was just in Albuquerque 2 days ago, and a bunch of people from Breaking Bad, and they were all there, and from Better Call Saul, because they're showing off the new Breaking Bad. There was an unveiling of the new statues that was in it. It's kind of cool. There's these bronze statues in Albuquerque now. But anyway, they had a great sketch. It's just for local trivia. You guys are in town, and you're in town. And he's also a great comedian and just such a brilliant guy. And he had this great sketch where it's this pop psychologist. That's the fly again. The fly literally went on the camera. Close up of the fly's belly. So he had this great sketch where, it's like Jack Black is in it. Some really good comedians, and they're all kind of figures in a person's head, and they're on. So you don't know that that's what it is at first. You're like watching a subway, and there's like an old lady and like a biker and a like Asian guy and whatever, and those end up being the archetypes. And he's like, and then the kind of doctor walks out, David Cross, he says, and these are the 4 archetypes: the biker, the old lady, the Asian guy, whatever. And it was the 90s, so it was a little bit less politically correct, but at least it was kind of like, but that's how the unconscious always works that way.
Stereotypes, you could say, are archetypes.
Yeah, stereotypes, archetypes, tokenization, all of it. It's all about acknowledging that these are always working, and you can't escape from them, and they're always going to be fundamental. You're going to have to contend with it one way or another through talking about it or thinking or anyway. But it was great because then David Cross comes out and he goes, and these are the complexes, and buy my book and take my seminar, and you can learn all about your complexes. And then Bob Odenkirk walks out in front, and the guy's like, what? And he's like, and then take my seminar, folks. It's the fake doctor. The complexes in your mind. The fake doctor. And the guy's like, no, I'm real. It's a great comedic thing. Yeah, it gets so meta because it's a great comedic thing. But there's so many of these self-help books that are, hero, warrior, lover. What is that? Robert.
Robert Moore and Gillette.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
More. More and Gillette. So anyway, there's all of these archetypes, and they're very useful. In fact, Gilles Deleuze, one of my favorite philosophers, French philosopher, wrote about conceptual personae, and he said that the way philosophy works is the philosopher has an idea for a concept, and they have to develop it. And sometimes they develop it for years and years and years, just like someone else might have an idea for a song, an idea for a poem, or an idea for anything. And a scientist has an idea for a formula, right? But the philosopher has this idea for the concept, and they develop it, and they do it through conceptual personae. And that's through the development of concept. Can say there's 3 types of people in the world. Yeah. And or Hegel can say, he can use these conceptual personae of, or Nietzsche saying, well, there's the true philosopher, then there's the historian of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And you have these figures, and each of these figures, it's really what it's saying is to actually develop an archetypal understanding of the complex. It's hard work that Jung worked years and years and years to be able to characterize.
And looked at many people in psychiatric wards and everything to see the ones that kind of showed up.
Yeah, and to try to kind of describe them in a way that was just as much art as science and required a tremendous amount of work. And so essentially, the archetype will only be as good as the teacher and the student. Mm-hmm. And so Jung can put in tens of thousands of hours to describing it, but somebody can misunderstand what he says, or can just gloss over it and say, oh, he's being sexist. And he gets accused of that all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And to this day, there's accusations of Jungian psychology being fundamentally sexist because it has fundamentally gendered complexes and so on. Mm-hmm. I think that now, post-Jungians and contemporary Jungians, I know that a number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I wrote an essay on degendering or looking at what is the other besides gender, because say you're non-binary, say you're trans, say you or not even or some
and just to note that too, like non-Western archetypes, because so many archetypes are there. I do believe there's collective archetypes, of course, but then different cultures have much more accessible non-gendered or non-binary like archetypes as well.
Yeah, and there was a wonderful point from Rick Tarnas, not specifically about this, but what he was saying was that two points. One is on the cultural level, and this is something I love about Richard Tarnas's work. Even if he's not into human design, I can still get something from it. He can't get anything from me, but I get a lot from him. And that was that. And for those who don't know, he wrote Cosmos and Psyche, this incredible work of kind of archetypal astrology. And so he says a couple things. One is different cultures have different kind of access to the archetypes in their traditions, and so in the Western culture with such stark individualism, we tend to have lots of Mars and Venus stories. And it's very easy to understand Mars and Venus, but it's very hard to understand Neptune. We don't have Maya. It's hard to understand Pluto. We don't have Kali. We don't have these transpersonal archetypes. And also those are just newer. I mean, maybe they're newer and older. Maybe they're from ancient indigenous traditions, but they've been lost into sort of, through the personal planets and the hyper-focus and hyper-personalism of the last few hundred years and so on, that has led to certain cultures losing access to archetypes in that way.
Yeah.
The other thing he said that I thought was great is he said there is no male and female archetype, and this is not, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but effectively, these are simply, every archetype has its male and female.
That's masculine and feminine,
Or masculine and feminine, and that even they are generics. So it's almost a cop-out, because it's almost, if somebody says, well, you're saying that this is masculine or feminine, that's sexist because you're saying that it's this and this and this and this. And I'm saying, well, I never said the feminine's that. I never said the masculine's that. I'm simply saying a binary formula. Yep. So I've never said that the feminine is always yielding or always agreeable or always this.
Well, and there's different cultures that have like like what we traditionally can, the sort of yang principle, the masculine principle, and in other cultures is completely flipped, right?
Sure.
They have different sort of.
And leaving it for each person to characterize it themselves means that if they are sexist and if they are, misogynist, or if they have any of these problems, if they have internalized depression, if they have any of that, then it's on them, because they're going to characterize it that way through their. It's like almost like, I'm not going to paint the picture for you. I'm going to tell you the formula, and I'm going to let you fill in all the blanks with these generic concepts. And so when you see that male or masculine and feminine can be the binary applied to any archetype, you suddenly see, okay, what is a female Mars archetype? Amazon warrior. What is a we already have the male Mars archetype. What's the female, right? We already have the female Venus archetype. What about the male one? Okay, Oscar Wilde, a dandy, sort of
Dionysus.
Sure, exactly. And there's so many of these, and so we can kind of. And there's a really wonderful point from Marie-Hélène Bruce, who's a great Lacanian, and she said for Lacan, gender is never a binary. Everything about Lacan's formulas of sexuation and gender is to eliminate the binary. So people that are now realizing that there is no binary gender, that's true. However, what Bruce said is something even more maybe controversial in this day and age of post-gender, which is that actually there are 4 genders. And I love that it coincides with the 4 bases, because he said, what Bruce says, she says, you can take a small child of 5 years old and ask them to describe, and they know there are boys, there are girls. And there are boyish boys and boyish girls, and there's girlish boys and girlish girls. And they immediately will tell you who's the boyish girl. Well, she's a girl, but she's kind of boyish, and they'll tell you as a 5-year-old, as only a 5-year-old will. And, oh, well, he's a boy, but he's kind of girlish. Oh, he's a boy, yeah, he's not girlish at all,
Yeah, and like, also other
so there's
cultures.
already 4. Yeah, and that's an example.
They have like 5 or 6
they have 5
or 8
or however many, variations of this and different kinds of words, and saying, oh, you're and recognizing these specific. And what are these words? They're conceptual personae, and how good or bad they are go from racist caricatures to extremely complex and subtle learning tools that help you understand very complex topics and complex situations. So conceptual personae, and again, there's a teacher and a student. The creator of their conceptual personae might have done the best job in the world and said, this is a great name for this, but then I go to West Virginia growing up there where I had long hair, so they said I'm girly boy. That's not really a great conceptual persona. That even doesn't get us very far.
It's not complex.
Go hang out with the girls because you're a girly boy. Yeah, it's not quite. I mean, it's like, I guess I liked the yin. I mean, Ra always said that he saw a clear division in the men that he grew up with, and that half of them some of them liked cars, and the others liked sex. He liked sex. I like sex. Now I like it. Gate 34. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm just saying there's a different, there's a... Okay, so before we go too far afield in this, so the complexes of Jung's complex psychology, these are like the conceptual personae, and we can talk about them at different levels of very precise and very specific, and every now and then there's a call for we need new complexes, and we need, what's after the hero's journey, and we need to degender. I've written essays on the Animex, which would be a degendered Anima/Animus, but it's hard to do because...
Yeah, and also I just want to name Ian Mackenzie's work. He really brings in that we are beyond the hero's journey. Hero's journey is individualism going up to the 1020, well, if you follow my mystical way as hero's journey, and we're moving into like a trickster era, and the trickster stories are a little more able to meet the complexity as a complex, the complexity of life.
Let's talk about the trickster. Let's circle back to that in a little bit, because I want to talk about Anima and Animus.
Yes.
And first I wanted to talk about the shadow, though. And I wanted to say that there's the personal shadow, and then there's the collective shadow of humans, but there's also the individual shadows. And I got in a good conversation last night, and I was actually talking to my mom a little bit about it today, about the different sort of shadows of different groups. And so white Americans have a tremendous shadow, particularly with colonialism and the mass murder and destruction imposed upon indigenous people, and then enslavement of black peoples. Black Americans have a very different, there's no symmetry here, and this is why Lacanians criticize Jung for being dual relation. That would say that somehow for Jung, the shadow of black Americans would be white Americans. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But the shadow of Jews would be Nazis. No, it doesn't work that way. The shadow of black Americans, as I understand it, and I'm completely open to being corrected, but as I understand it, is actually the internalized oppression that oppresses other black Americans. See, it's not symmetrical. So both cases black Americans get, and that's what it is to be in an oppressed minority group. And same for indigenous populations. It's the internalized oppression against each other that is the shadow, that is the counterpoint. But part of that internalized oppression is through opposite othering, by saying, don't be too white, look at you, you've lost your culture.
As a light-skinned native, I've been in those experiences many times.
Well, thanks for validating that to me, because I'm completely open to being wrong here, but I'm just saying this is my sort of Jungian understanding, is that there's no symmetry. It's not that, for the Nazis, their shadow is the Jew and vice versa. No, there's no like vice versa in any of it. It's like one side was the oppressor, one side was the oppressed. And there's no. And
complexes developed out of that, but they weren't. Yeah, I don't.
And now Germany has a collective complex around its shadow of that racism and so on. And there's a tremendous complex.
I just did an ancestral work week with, and two folks were German, and a huge part of that process was literally dealing with the grief and the shame of the Nazi connection.
Oh yeah.
That was a huge part of the ancestral work that they were doing.
That is a huge thing, and it absolutely is. So the complexes exist at these collective levels. We engage with them. Now, something Jung said that I thought was very, very healing is that nobody can feel like you're talking about this need to shame. He said nobody can ultimately take the responsibility and the burden of their ancestors upon them, and can actually, you have to feel like there has to be the minimal fantasy, even if it's not true, that you're doing good in the world. Because if you fundamentally believe you're doing bad in the world, or that you are bad, or that you came from something bad, or that you're of bad blood, or bad ancestry, or bad whatever, there's no chance. There is zero chance you have to build self-esteem. You have to build a kernel of value.
And that's through confronting the shadow, too.
And that's through confronting the shadow, because it's only when you confront it. So Jung said the shadow was the minor piece, and the contrasexual impulse was the masterpiece. And the minor piece, or the apprentice piece, he called it. He was very, eloquent in his way. People say it wasn't a very easy to understand writer, but he was probably like Shakespeare or something. He just used a lot of really obscure words.
He made up words too.
He made up so many words. He was probably Shakespeare in the past life. He was a descendant of Goethe, just ancestrally speaking. He was a literal descendant of Goethe. But in any case, so Jung, who coined the term complex, who created complexes, and also just to go back, people don't realize this, the word association experiment. I say a word, you say another word. I say dog, you say tree. I say cat, you say this. And I say certain words, and then a certain words you get stuck on. He developed that in the late 1800s. And Jung developed that as in his 20s as his theory of the complex is developed, because he was looking for the complex. And when he would say a certain word and then there was a pause and he had no association to that word, he noted it. He didn't care what word you associated. You say any word you want to the association. He only cared when you couldn't associate a word, because that meant he caught it. He found the complex. He'd hit upon a trigger. People say triggered, and we all know about being triggered and getting. People saw me get a little triggered yesterday at the 9-Century Healing talk. Anyway, we all get triggered. We all get triggered. And human design doesn't mean you never get triggered. It means you don't make decisions when you're triggered. That's all it means. And there's not some. I was saying earlier, like the ideal of stoicism is like necessary on the design side and like toxic masculinity on the personality side. Because it's saying on the personality side you can't show your crying and your fear and your pain, but on the design side we don't want people to make decisions when they're in that state. And the design is the thing that makes the decisions, and so you need a certain stoicism of the design to be able to like weather the storm and not make the decision.
An acceptance kind of
thing. It's like surrender to the design, and instead of going, I'm going to change my ticket now because this happened, or I'm going to make a different plan now because this happened. The impulse to change the plan is the mind trying to control the life by saying this goes against my will as tyrant of the body, and I'm going to now change it. And so there's something about like waiting for all of the conflict to kind of pass. But that doesn't mean that we should idolize a lack of reactivity or a stoicism in the personality side. First and second line personalities are going to be very reactive. Question?
Well, kind of how I understand it is that what a trigger does is it activates a complex.
You're saying what? Sorry, I want to hear it again. What a trigger does is it activates.
The complex, right? Yeah. So all this psychic energy comes from that complex, and the complex can possess you. And and that complex is fed by behavior. The possession is fed by you reinforcing the possession through acting on its behalf, basically instrumentalizing yourself to it.
You become an instrument for it to act in the world.
But if that doesn't compel behavior, then every time you do that, you're depriving it of energy. And so if the trigger remains, the next time the complex is activated, it has less energy. And over time, it becomes energy deprived because you're not feeding it with any of your actions.
You're not creating new domino effects. You're not creating new unclosed loops.
And that is kind of like the confrontation of the complexes. Not in the shadow, but like just bringing awareness to the fact that like, oh yeah, the mother wound complex or the mother complex in me is being activated right now. Just bringing that awareness to it.
And I'll give a quick example of how Jungians interpret complexes too, because we hear this all the time. And there's a mother complex, this or that. Was it? I'm trying to remember. Robert A. Johnson describes it this way. He says, the complex is. The mother complex is especially strong in male psychology. So already this raises questions of, then is that same for trans male psychology? There was a lot of research done, like this was the 70s. There weren't a lot of trans male, like Jungians at that time. There were probably some, but they weren't, sharing notes on like, does this emerge the same way? But we do know that in what we consider male psychology, which has its own decoupled from what we would call the biological or physiological aspects, male psychology has certain traits, and these traits do have to do, in some part, I actually like Lacan's explanation. He said there's an asymmetry of the genders because a little boy is born, his first other is the mother, and he says, she's different from me. Then he sees a man and says, he's the same as me, and he has sameness and difference. A little girl is born and says, here's the mother, she's the first symbol of otherness, she's different than me. Then she sees a man and says, he's different from me. And she sees other women and says, they're different from me too. There is
that
no
builds on Freud's work a little bit too as well.
Yeah, there's no symbol for sameness. There is only difference. There is only radical difference. And this is why the feminine and Freudian and Lacanian is the fundamental subjectivity. That subjectivity is based on the feminine, essentially.
An objectivity on the...
Yeah, which is why men are judged in terms of object value, and that there's an objectification of women, which is always seen as kind of problematic because it's the masculinization of women. There's some interesting things that, it's all very complicated when you get into this, but it's almost like because it's disrespecting the role of the feminine and saying there is no role of the feminine, it's eradicating the feminine, trying to erase it and turn them all into men too, in some metaphorical sense, but it's a very complex topic.
Yeah, there's I know some people who could really go into that.
Well, maybe this will be we'll do a little podcast or something. It'd be great. So but in terms of the fundamental otherness, that someone who's being told, or being assigned their gender at birth and being told you're a boy and other boys are the same as you, and those are girls, they're different. You're a girl, other boys are different from you, and by the way, the other girls are different too, because your mother, who we all came from, is the fundamental symbol of otherness. So the symbol of otherness is also identical to the symbol of self, right? This is like a really interesting fundamental dynamic when we get into gender studies. of just the asymmetry between them. It's not that there's just two that are the same. It's also how men describe the difference between men and women very differently than the way women describe the difference between men and women.
Yeah.
You know, there's like multiple differences at work here. So, but Jung says that all of this, that the anima and the animus and that the contrasexual impulses are reserved until you've gone through the shadow. You have to go through a certain level of shadow work. And shadow work is very buzzwordy and very sort of appealing to a whole lot of people who would never, ever, ever have anything to do with human design, because they'd never be willing to do half the sacrifices that human design requires. But I will say that Jung did lay the groundwork for something like a path of subjective destitution, of giving up our fantasies, of giving up and sacrificing. And everybody who understands the human design knows that you basically sacrifice everything that used to make you happy. You sacrifice the not self. You sacrifice the pleasure you used to take in complaining about your suffering. You sacrifice all the enjoyment that you got from the not self, which is the enjoyment of essentially being in a state of pain. It's a sort of painful pleasure. It really is.
You're addicted to it.
Yeah, we get addicted to the painful pleasure of the not self, and you give all that up. And so you get cut off from the feel-good tap of being able to complain about all the things going wrong in your life, but you get, and it's so much more. I mean, the sacrifices people make. Stephen was talking about his sacrifices of 8 years of biological, very intense physical deconditioning. He said what took Ra a week took him, 8 years. 8 days to 8 years, yeah.
And I think you're speaking to just the individuation process, to the differentiation, the discernment.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't mean to say that Jungian groups are not laying the groundwork for individuation, but for instance, I know someone who was invited to the conference, didn't come, different trajectory, does men's groups, goes to the Jungian men's groups. The kind of stuff they do in the men's groups is great, and it is helping at some level, but it's also very different from human design. It's like, it's going to only take you so far. And Jung, I think, could have gone far enough to go into human design, but a lot of Jungians would not have followed him there, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just saying, what is it really? What is the value for you? It's like there's a great kind of conceptual personae from Jason Hawley. So Jason Hawley likes to talk about the daylight problems, the nighttime problems, and the twilight problems. And when somebody comes in and they have daylight problems, they can't keep a job. They can't get up in the morning. It's actually Jerry Seinfeld, the great philosopher Jerry Seinfeld, had the same philosophical conceptual personae. He said there's night man and there's day man. And day man can't really do much to night man. Night man stays up late. He spends all day man's money. He makes it really hard to get up. What can day man do? Day man's kind of all he can really do is sleep in, lose his job, and then not have any money. So night man can't buy any, can't go out and party. But it's like what problem are we dealing with? Those would both be day world problems, because the problem would be, how do I keep a job? How do I have money? How do I be well adjusted? How do I stop fighting with people? These are the kinds of things, like, I'm a huge fan of dynamic deconstructive psychotherapy based on the work of Derrida, and it's used for treatment-resistant borderline personality disorder. That's a day world problem. If somebody has treatment-resistant borderline personality disorder and comes to the conference, it's going to be very difficult for any of us to interact in any meaningful way, because that means there's a harm to themselves and others, and they're doing very erratic and possibly violent and dangerous things.
Yeah.
However,
they can't exist in the day world very well.
They can't, but dynamic deconstructive psychotherapy does wonders and helps, working on things like alterity and otherness and conceptualization of how other people, and all these amazing things. And somebody who goes through that may then be able to be around other people no problem, right? And so they've gone to the day world. Well, then we have the night world problem. This is somebody who's taken care of all of their that side of it, but they've sort of lost the adventure. They've lost the spark. They're staying up at night. The day world is set, but they're just too cozy, and they're just waiting, and they're neat structured. This is air conditioned. This is air conditioned nightmare. Yeah, this is the air conditioned nightmare.
That's when symptoms usually start showing up for those people.
Yeah, the symptom is the night world erupting through because they don't have a day world problem. The day world's fine. They paid their bills. They have a night world problem. The night is erupting and bursting. So you might say that a borderline personality is also a night world issue, but I think it's primarily day world, because it's mostly about how do I shut off the tap to my unconscious, whereas the night world is how do I get in touch with my unconscious, because I did shut off the tap too much.
And then they said that dark night of the soul
Is
Yeah,
It's kind of it's one of those processes.
That's probably as you're moving beyond the day world into the twilight, because the twilight problem is, how do I stay in the twilight? How do I keep this from falling into the day or the night world?
Well,
and there's no permanent answer there. You just have to keep it living and keep it alive and keep it changing.
So I don't know if you've heard of Arnold Meidell's work and process work, but he's really he's like post-Jungian, and he talks about supporting people entering into the night world, right? And he does it through an archetypal or slash complex amplification, starting in the body, like a somatic amplification of symptoms, whether they're psychological, physical, or both, and how that opens the door. And it can be through dreams, it can be through anxieties, it can be through cancer, it can be through any of these things that bring us into the dark night, but an amplification to see what's there and actually confront that. And I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking, like, there is these ways that people can develop, and shamanism itself is like, and it's many definitions. We could spend an hour talking about it, but it's
and even things like NLP, which I'm not a big fan of, but I do think works. It's just kind of a question of
ethics.
How. But is it ethical and so on?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like auto-suggestion a little bit, but there it is. It's true. Like you can do these kind of shamanic interventions where you go in there and get those feelings and kind of confront them. So the complex is then, I just want to kind of start with the shadow, and then I think we'll move to the Anima Animus, and then we'll end it on that, which will bring us to the Trickster, which is one of the Animus archetypes.
Right, got the details, got the flow.
So, got the details and the flow, so you got all the context. So for the shadow work, what that's really about is, in the beginning, the shadow is sort of merged in with everything that's not me. So there is no differentiation. In fact, if I identify as male, then women are the shadow. And I'm going to actually be like misattributing all sorts of negative intentions to them that they never had, because I've simply combined it.
Projection.
But projections. Men are also going to be my shadow, though, because they're going to be competition to me, and especially if they look a little different than me, they'll be my shadow. There's a real competition with the other, and we'll talk about othering. Like that's something that Sully said, that many reflectors feel othered by the community, and that this othering is really when somebody makes them the shadow, and the shadow is basically saying, you're not me, but you're also, I'm a human, so therefore you're not human in some sense. It's almost like
this is fifth line stuff too.
You're not like me.
I always think of fifth line in this similar context as well.
And
of like being able to receive these projections, and fifth line sort of being, I don't know, I see how fifth lines can actually reflect back to us our own complexes, our own sort of
because we get people kind of,
if you're projecting, you're actually looking at it,
expectations on us, and then out of those expectations, and so it kind of, and things will reach a point. So as far as the shadow, most shadow work really is in the high school years, but sometimes it just stops there. Sometimes it keeps going. And most of the shadow work, it's really called the minor piece, because the real challenge is to essentially, it's almost like self-love. Like the challenge is to essentially retract your competition with other people that are like you, that are competing, and stop othering them, and stop. So there's a real like an example would be there's a fairy tale of a man who has the most perfect wife ever. She's a magical wife. She appears in a beanstalk or something, one of those kind of things. But she makes him promise that he'll never go back during the day. And she has to leave her alone. Well, he goes back in the day. Sure enough, he sees her. He catches her with a skeleton, and they're dancing, and they're on this like bridge up to the moon or something. It's a fairy tale, so it's very, very imaginative. Well, the kind of explanation of this that von Franz gives, who's the great storyteller of kind of storytelling analysis, Jungian, disciple of Jung, is that this is the shadow that has not yet detached from the anima, from the contrasexual impulse. Mm-hmm. It's still close together, and that there's this, and if you can think about it, there's the jealousy and the hatred that another man enjoys the company of my woman, or whatever, something like that. Well, that other man is the shadow, is the skeleton. Mm-hmm. So until the shadow's been retracted, there's going to be a hatred of other men. Now, what's interesting is Lacan was right on this. He was pointing out in the 1970s that conspiracy theorists were predominantly male. And he said that it consists of predominantly repressed homosexuality, because the paranoia involved in the conspiracy theorists is a male paranoia that it consists of endlessly rephrasing, I hate him, the man that is doing the oppression. Or I hate the masculinized woman, like people who hate like Hillary Clinton or something. They don't really hate a female character, they hate a male character that they're just using a female representative to, trying to portray her as a male and so on. And so it's a really interesting thing because there's a real rejection of the self-love. So in fact, Lacan had a guy that was obsessed with the fact that his wife was cheating on him, and he wanted to prove it, so he hired a guy to take all the photos and so on, brings him to Lacan, and Lacan just basically says, okay, so you made some kind of, you got these kinky pictures, right? Right? I mean, that's kind of the real reason he was doing it was his own repressed homosexual desire. But I mean, that's not what Lacan exactly said. He said, the fact that I diagnosed you paranoid and that you found out that your paranoia was true does not change the diagnosis in any way, shape, or form. And that diagnosis is linked to a hatred of men, which because the unconscious knows no love or hate, is no different. It knows no negation. Saying I hate him is the same as saying I love him, but it can't accept the love.
Yeah,
Accept that.
and just to like give it like the practical of the shadow. I mean, and there should be more nuance in this, but like the shadow is those places that we do not either know about ourselves, or it was not. We learned very early on it was not safe to know those parts of ourselves, and so much of this, like when we, I mean, so many, what's the term? But like so many just different symptoms and different like psychological disorders, like so many of them in a Jungian context are there because there's aspects of the self that haven't been confronted or haven't been seen, and the pop shadow work is just trying to, go like, oh, I hate this man. Like I always say this with Sacred Sons, like people's first response to Sacred Sons, again, like I said yesterday, was like, oh, just a bunch of muscular dudes and they're like fighting, and people see that and their response is like, oh, not interested in that at all. But it's also because some aspect of themselves is not sort of, they haven't integrated, right? They haven't seen that aspect, that they haven't owned that aspect of themselves, so it's like projected outward.
Yeah, it's triggering to them because that's a part of themselves they can't stand. And that's actually what Jung said to Marie-Louise von Franz when he met her. She was 18 years old, and this is what got her hooked on a lifetime of kind of Jungian psychology that she was devoted to for the rest of her life. Was he said, okay, the first thing I want you to do is write down a list of everything you can't stand in others, particularly other women. And she wrote down every last quality, and then she showed it to Jung and said, okay, this is what I can't stand in them. And he said, these are all parts of you cannot accept about yourself.
Yes.
You do all these things, but you don't want to see those, you can't see those, and so you have to see how you're rejecting those and you're trying to prove it, you can't, you're not those, and all of it. So the shadow is essentially the parts of ourselves we reject. Now what's interesting is it starts united with the contrasexual impulse because we can't allow ourselves to express the contrasexual impulse. Because we become hyper-caricatured versions. In fact, this is also very controversial. There's a wonderful book called Female Perversions by Louise Kaplan. The movie is not so good, but the book is, they made a movie out of it. I don't know why, but it's like a weird, like it's like a fiction movie too. I don't know why, but they literally, I was reading about the book, but it's an incredible book because men are by far like 9 or 10 times more diagnosed, or not even diagnosed, but just sort of judged as in the pervert category. There's just so much more perversion among men than women. So female perversion was really interesting. But it found there's one called homeovestism, which is women who are just obsessed with dressing as the girliest girl you can possibly dress as. Barbie doll level of girly girl. And that would be an exact example of someone who then has an extremely strong fused shadow of male and shadow because she can't express. She's gone to the extreme of being unable to express. She can't let her hair grow out.
No masculinity.
She can't go outside without makeup on. She can't go out and do these things. Whereas the ability to freely and fluidly move between them and be comfortable with yourself in different ways and different forms, and be comfortable being very feminine and comfortable being very masculine and comfortable going through these different positions is kind of a sign of the healthy ego that is not threatened by, oh, I don't want people to think I'm gay as a guy or whatever,
Yeah, totally.
And
just a way that I consider this too is for folks who are beyond between the gender binary, when they live their lives as themselves, and this is why I am so honored to know so many folks that consider themselves this way, when they truly live themselves, like they do the shadow work, right? They are fully in that work, and for for folks who are a little more like cis, we can more comfortably fall into the complexes, or we can fall more into certain things, and I don't know. So I think that I just want to.
I dated someone who was NB and had all NB friends, and so a whole group of NB people with me, and not people who are NB, then, so for those who don't know, that's the kind of short term for non-binary. And it was really interesting because I did see a tremendous amount of complexes at work, unchecked complexes, and I saw a really toxic atmosphere of people who were marginalized, sort of spreading internalized oppression amongst each other through really toxic attitudes about complexes in particular, like not allowing the sort of, so I was very, it was a really rough kind of, I felt my heart went out. I was like, it is so hard to not be heteronormative in this world, like to actually be so marginalized, because we already are so alienated from each other, and then to now have these extra layers upon layers of alienation. But I see what you're saying is like it forces the confrontation of the complexes, whereas somebody who is comfortable in their predominantly white life as a white person who's not being confronted with the shadows of oppression and of colonialism, and they get to kind of just have it be invisible. It's like that whole like not in my backyard.
Yeah.
From NIMBYism to NIMBYism, right? We could say no. You know what that is? It's not in my backyard. It's like sort of white privilege of wanting to not have to see the.
And that's why when I see folks who have these things that are marginalized, they live out these dualities, or the color of their skin, or any of those things, they do become a reflection of the shadow in other people, like other people, right? The projection happens and all those things, and that's why I think it's so threatening sometimes for us to see folks who are so different than us, but are owning that and like integrate it fairly well, and actually just like owning the power of that, because that deeply confronts these parts of ourselves that are terrified of confronting that. So I always think of Alok being Manon, and they're just sort of the way that they show up online. I don't know if people know who that is, but anyway, it's just this people are deeply confronted because of their sort of strength in being able to just own that in between space, the place that people often relegate to shadow, right? So just want to name that too.
Yeah, and then what the main thing about the shadow, the shadow work, Von Franz said she had a great example of a dream one of her clients had, who was a boy who had dreamed he was an eagle who had actually, that guy has serious shadow work to do. That is his shadow. He's a very big shadow.
Case in point.
Really big shadow, let me tell you. So, but for this dream, he basically dreamt that he was an eagle who then shat on his best friend's head.
Aww.
This is a classic shadow dream because the friend was competition. They were similar age, they were similar gender. That even no matter how, the more that you say we're friends, the more there's a stronger shadow of competition that then has to be confronted. Whereas the more you kind of accept that everybody's going to have competition and cooperation, and you allow for the ambiguity and so on, you can accept that. But it's like he was having these dreams because it was showing him he needed to accept that he didn't like certain things about his friend. But by preventing himself from seeing that, because a good friend likes their friend, a good friend doesn't dislike their friend, so he wouldn't allow himself to see the things he disliked. It has to come out in other ways, in these dreams of, getting revenge by being an eagle that's, above and, superior being, and kind of just his friends down below.
That dream, she also said, was a question of introversion and extroversion. That it was a compensation because his friend was very extroverted.
Right, and he was an introvert. That was his compensation. So that's what the introverts dream about when they leave the big extroverted.
So when we
sitting on their heads.
when we attempt to, I guess, integrate shadow, then you said the Anima and the Animus sort of show up, right? And this is,
they start to distinguish them. Yeah. So from the shadow it moves to the masterpiece, which is so much more difficult and never really finishes. But the masterpiece is effectively the development of a relationship to our inner muse. And there's going to be two key developments that, I don't want to say just muse, because that's kind of gendered, but it shouldn't be. But our inner guide, our psychopomp, our Virgil, our however you want to look at it.
Yeah, would you call it daemon?
Yeah, in some sense. And there's all different, again, conceptual personae, different ways of characterizing it. And some characterizations will be better than others. Some will land more than others because people will have different archetypal resonances and so on. But the interesting one is, so what I'm going to do now is actually do 4 more conceptual personae, and we'll do men, and then we'll do women. We'll do 4 more conceptual personae for the Anima for men, and then for Animus for women. Now, I would love to hear, for those who do not identify as men or women, I would also love to hear from trans men and women, to hear if they have noticed anything in particular about it. Do they identify as having more? Because James Hillman pointed out that even Jung said we both have anima and animus. It's just an asymmetrical relationship. That the anima for men is the kind of ideal woman that really can capture his attraction. And the animus is the kind of man that ideal woman is attracted to.
Yeah.
In the male psyche.
In the male psyche.
And the female.
And it's actually a reflection of the self, not necessarily about the actual. Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it is kind of like the imagination of what kind of guy she would like.
Mm-hmm.
And so the men can try to be animus men. Mm-hmm. And when you try to be an animus man, you'll see as we go through these that people can gain tremendous power by identifying with the archetypes. They gain so much power through their identification with it at the cost of their humanity.
Yep.
This is the not self in the archetypes,
Yep.
in the complexes, is that we essentially become a puppet for these transpersonal forces.
Mm-hmm.
We become a plaything for immoral gods. And so it's not pretty. So, and of course Robert Moore famously said archetypes are not benign, they're not neutral, they are toxic, they are contagious, they spread,
Yep.
they are radioactive, and they're not content until they've taken over all of you. They want to take over 100%.
They want to possess you.
Yeah, they want to possess you completely.
And you can consciously allow them to on your own will, but you can't. They can just take over you too.
Yeah,
Yep.
and that's when you're triggered, right? That's the triggers.
Yeah.
So now we're just gonna do the kind of, so just to be clear, for Jung, there is anima and animus in both male and female psychology.
Yeah.
We can also talk about non-binary psychology, but because we were all gendered at birth, from a psychoanalytic perspective, the asymmetry of the fact that everyone came from a woman and that the mother was the first other for the baby means that symbolically you basically are going to, whatever you're assigned as is still going to be a fundamental signifier of otherness and is still going to essentially gender your psyche, whether you like it or not, one way or the other. And that might even be an interesting avenue into the discussion of trans. Okay, for another day. But now let's do the sort of normative version of it. So everything normative, it's so funny because we criticize heteronormative gender norms, and a lot of critics of Jung criticize Jung for having heteronormative gender norms, yet he himself has his own criticism of heteronormative gender norms as being what he calls the oscillation between the first and second level anima and animus. So we're going to do male psychology first, and for no reason, not for that. Don't look at me that way.
I didn't. No.
Because no, we're doing it only because I think it'll help for the ending, and we get to the trickster archetype, which is the animus and the female psychology. See, trickster is a female figure. It's a female figure of the male. The animus is the fourth level. The trickster is the fourth level animus. So we're going to get to that. So taking a step back, male psychology. Jung critiques heteronormative, sort of impoverished views of femininity as themselves hovering around level one, the baseline of unindividuated anima that cannot be distinguished from the mother. And it's the sort of archetype of anima as mother, which is the virgin whore. It is the sort of desire for there's all these terrible things that we have in it, but it's basically all of the toxic masculine traits. Then there's the second level of anima, which is the woman as autonomous being, sort of the emancipated, empowered woman, and essentially most men have a psychology level that hovers between the two. They go between the appreciation of one and the attraction to one or the other, but at a very fundamental level they're attracted. And also there is in the first level of anima, there is what we call the anima woman, who is every man's fantasy. There's a really funny discovery that Dario Nardi found. Dario Nardi is a neuroscientist who was trying to find out all sorts of things about personality, and he found out that everyone universally across the board agrees who the most attractive is, and it's based on relative to who else is there. And that no matter what, there's no preferences. We all say we like this kind of person or that kind of person, but whenever we're actually surveyed and we rank people, we actually all agree who's the most attractive. And the one who's most attractive is the one who can attract the projections, who has essentially given up the most of their humanity to identify with a transpersonal form that is appealing to the most amount of people, to gain power over those people and to gain the surplus enjoyment and surplus power. This is basically the not self at work.
Yeah,
this is the not self at work.
And I was going to say, it's unconscious too. It's not like there's just sociopaths. There is sociopaths doing this, but then there's also just folks who don't have it integrated.
I would argue it makes them sociopathic.
Yeah.
At its extreme.
But
in any case, it's the cause of sociopathy. It's the complete loss of individual humanness and the complete loss of humanity and loss of empathy for other humans and being taken over by this transpersonal force. So it happens so in our case, we're talking about male psychology. We're talking about the anima woman. The anima woman appears helpless, appears waif-like, appears in need. Everything is ambiguous so that a man can imagine any detail about her. He just fills in the blanks. She's a blank slate. There's nothing behind the projection, but she keeps it intentionally vague. She omits details. She leaves out certain key facts so that he can fill it in and imagine that she has certain likes and dislikes and whatever else that fit his fantasy.
What was this called?
She gains a tremendous amount of power from this.
What was this called?
This is the Anima woman. So this is basically
Is this a level 1? Or?
well, no, this would just be a woman who's identified with the Anima. But yeah, kind of level 1 Anima. The Animus man is a man who's the strong, silent type who pulls up in the car on the motorcycle
The
with a
alpha
leather
male.
jacket, who doesn't just drives off into the road, all that stuff.
Yeah, Marlboro Man. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and there are men that have a tremendous amount of advantage that they've gained at the expense of their humanity. This is the real meaning of the deal with the devil. You lose your soul, you lose your humanity. That's what it is. You become an archetype. You don't get your story, you get the story of generic alpha male man.
Yep.
The alpha male.
And then usually their Uranus opposition comes around, and then they hate their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not really
Hopefully,
ready to adapt
hopefully that
to it.
happens.
Yeah. Revenge from all the betas. No, I'm joking. Okay, so I don't believe in such things. I don't use those words.
Yeah.
But
totally.
but it's just fun to joke about. But it is. But as far as the Anima level 1, so the development from level 1 to level 2 is already a momentous psychic development that many men will never achieve, and if they do, they will often lose it through regression back to, essentially wanting this sort of level 1 Anima woman. Now,
And that's because the ego is so threatened in that.
Yeah, exactly, and
Yeah.
it can't withstand that contact and so on, and also because the Anima brings us into contact with the unconscious, and it's really tough. I mean, it's hard. It can bring us all sorts of things, and I'd love to do a follow-up talk where we just talk about the role of Eros in a man's life. But then I'll just simply say that the level 4 or level 3 and 4 then are developed more they all have nicknames. Like it goes from Eve to then Helen and so on, and they kind of go on. And the 4th, I believe, is Sophia, because it finally goes on to divine wisdom. And so this is the sort of goal, and the goal is to reach a certain level around 3 or 4. 3, I think, is sort of understanding female psychology. If I had to encapsulate it, it would be understanding how women see the world, and that there is a difference between how men see the world, and for the first time realizing, wow, there are these fundamentally different ways. And that's like a true understanding of alterity. It's not othering women, it's alterity. It's modeling and mentally modeling, being able to put yourself in their shoes and experience the world through their eyes, and see how other men look to women, and see how ridiculous men can be, and so on. And then the level 4 is Sophia. And the way I'm going to explain it for men is, at a personal level, the achievement, even if it's only for a glimpse, and even if we forget it, the achievement of the level of development of the Anima coincides with one very specific thing. For men, there is a fundamental lack of psychologization. That means that at a fundamental level, the level 1 Anima says, she left me for my best friend because she's a vindictive bitch who wants to hurt me. Mm-hmm. That's not why she did it. She likes him. She's attracted to him. It even doesn't even understand that women are sexual beings. Like level 1 Anima wants them to be completely non-sexual beings until and if they're desired to be, but then it's all compartmentalized and rejected and shamed, and I have to self-flagellate. And there's this whole screwed up, toxic patriarchal complex built into level 1 to Anima understandings and interactions. It really does get to, and there's a fundamental point where if you can get past this, which is extremely difficult, which requires overcoming the hatred of other men, the fear of homosexuality, and the fear of all the homophobia and internalized depression against other men, and all of that aspect, and getting through all of these things, giving up all of the QAnon and all of the conspiracy theory, because that really is just what I'm talking about. That's exactly part of it. And once you give up all that stuff and kind of get to this next level, you get a reward. And the reward is the healing salve for all men, which is the psychological understanding that heals all wounds, that washes over you like a gentle warm water.
It's the thigh wound as well.
You actually see what she saw in the guy. You actually see the reason it's not about you. She isn't even thinking about you. You don't even exist in that that economy. That you're not a part of that. Your libido doesn't matter, your dick doesn't matter, whatever. To the guy, he needs to have this sort of understanding of alterity, true alterity, of being able to kind of experience the other as it, not othering. Again, it's not experiencing them as other, but it's experiencing them as having the same depth and the same complexity and the truly unique psychological process that is healing, because it allows the man to say, this is right and as it should be, and I get to retain my masculinity, and now instead of being proud and hurt because of my pride, I can be proud to not react and not call this new guy a jerk and not get into a competition and not make women uncomfortable through stalking and not do all these terrible toxic things that men do. Right?
Yeah, and I think one of the keys here with men's work is men learning how to trust other men, and this because there's a fundamental like competition that is set up for us really early on, or a lack of safety with other men, whether that's our fathers or our peers. And
men rape other men just as much as they rape other women. I mean,
sexual abuse.
Men are not safe for anyone. I mean, come on,
But learning to be with men that you can trust, I think opens the door in a lot of ways to this development as well.
Yeah.
Teo, what's the thigh wound you referenced?
Oh, I mentioned the thigh wound because a part of like the mythological development of men is the thigh wound, and it happens in a lot of different myths, and it's sort of like a masculine representation of the opening, the womb opening, the vagina for men, right? And they do it through this confrontation or through this wounding, and then through that wounding they have a connection to the feminine in them, right? So the thigh wound is, when you were talking about that, I was just kind of thinking, in mythologically, it's the thigh wound that's sort of.
And I'm going to finish male psychology and jump to female, but I want to do two short stories. One is, what's his name? There's a French philosopher, and I think this gets, so the thigh wound in the opening up, I never realized that. There's a real theme in Deleuze's work of becoming worthy of the event, and of a sort of male psychology of the soldier who becomes mutilated or loses access to their limbs or loses all these capacities, not becoming bitter to life and not hating life, but overcoming it. And I wanted to bring it back to when Robert A. Johnson talks about the mother complex in men. He says, this is the teenager who you want to pour the bucket of cold water on his head. He won't get out of bed. He puts the covers over his head. He's immobile. You can't reach him. He's flat as wood. You can tap on him and he doesn't react. There's nothing there. He's completely paralyzed and immobile. And he has a defeatist, fatalist attitude that says nothing can be done. Why bother? Don't even bother, right? Yeah. And that's what happens. The mother complex comes up tenfold when you become paraplegic. When you have the thigh wound that completely destroys your ability. And so I wanted to mention there's this French philosopher, and the name might come to me later, but he had such an incredible example of becoming worthy of the event. He had a jazz show. This is, let's see, it's like Bernard, it's Stiegler. So Stiegler is this great French philosopher. He had a jazz club. He had all these jazz shows. He got really in debt with the mob in France. Then he began robbing banks to pay them back. He robbed 3 banks, he got caught, he got sent to jail for life. But he didn't have this fatalist, defeatist attitude. I'm sure he did for a little bit, but then he goes, okay, I'm life in prison and whatever, but I'm going to studies philosophy, never really knew philosophy, starts studying, learns it, gets so good that he gets like a pardon, like a presidential pardon type thing, 7 years in, and Derrida takes him under his wing and he becomes a chair at a philosophy school where he still teaches to this day. That is the male spirit. Mm-hmm. That is the male spirit that does not know defeat, that does not know the fatalism.
Or uses defeat as transformation.
Yeah, that gets the wound, and that wound opens it up to the feminine, and it humbles, and it says, no, I can't be a bank robber, I better be a philosopher. Mm-hmm. And so, better do something else now. Okay, so I want to move over to the female archetypes, then we are kind of running a little bit late, but the female archetypes, so for men, the key moment in a man's psychological development is when he gains the healing salve, which he will never give up. He will clutch it tightly to his breast for the rest of his life, because it allowed him to never ever be angry at any new boyfriend of an ex-girlfriend ever again, to never ever be angry to be able to have infinite compassion and understanding, to never have the jealousy, to never have all of these toxic feelings that eat him up. Don't they say jealousy is like trying to poison yourself to hurt the other, And that is the healing salve, is that really it's the realization of the interconnectedness and interpersonal relation of everyone that says, hey, I don't have to, I no longer have to fight and compete with any of this and all of this. I can just surrender to it.
Acknowledging the complex psychologies and selfhood of everybody.
Exactly, and alterity, development of alterity,
yeah.
Which is development of a true understanding of otherness, not othering, but a true understanding of otherness. Okay, so for women, it's this a little bit different, and I'm drawing from Jung, and this may be different because there's different cultural times. At his time, the key project of women was essentially the same thing, developing to this higher level of animus. But it's so hard. You have to sacrifice and give up so much. I mean, there are plenty of women out there who will be anima women for a guy. It will be level 1 all day long, and a guy can stay with that level 1. And there's plenty of guys out there who will be a level 1 animus for a woman, and you can find them, and they'll be that way for the rest of their lives, you know. And you can have that. And that's the strong, silent guy who is the breadwinner, who does this and does that, and whatever traditional toxic ass shit we've had to live with.
Toxic stoicness.
Toxic stoicness. Yeah, like we were talking about earlier. There's the good and bad stoicness. This is the bad one. So, and then it goes to the level 2, and that's just as bad. I mean, maybe it's slightly better, but the level 2 man is the romantic, the poet, the adventurer, the world traveler, the musician, the singer, the romantic. So there's either the tough guy or the romantic. And those are the first two, and those are both toxic in their own way, you know. Just like, I guess, the first two for, you know, women are either the pushover or the autonomous but spunky tomboy, whatever kind of like tokenized, you know, masculine trait that they throw in there. It's not
which
good.
isn't their wholeness either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. These are not, and also these are just caricatures that one gender makes of the other. You know, these are not really the real person at all. I mean, this is
They're
all
not
like
individuated.
No, this is like, and that's what we're doing, is we're trying to individuate them, and we're trying to actually differentiate them and be able to allow for difference. Okay, so as the animus develops, it goes to the man of words, which is the third animus figure, leaving behind the romantic for essentially what is more like a hierophant figure who says, I will teach. Now, I'm a very animus 3 level. And yeah, and I'm kind of a 2-3 a lot of times. Sometimes I get to 4, but very few women can be attracted to an animus 4. I mean, I get to the level 4 too, and I think Jenny can stay attracted to me, which is a testament to her, because the animus 4 is the trickster, and that is the ultimate illusion that has to be popped for women, is the consistency of man, because they say everything in this world is inconsistent, but I can hang my hat on old Jem. No, you can't. No, you can't, okay? And so what women get, which is the equivalent of this soothing balm that men get of understanding into how to not be jealous and shit like that, what they get is nobody anywhere ever can stop me. I am all alone in this world. Nobody else matters. It is the enlightened selfishness of what I was saying about that guy in jail who's like, I got life in prison, but maybe I can just keep going and just through the pure force of will and spirit, persevere. And that is the level 4 animus, is the sort of the acceptance that no one man will ever be good enough to embody and satisfy all of the needs of a woman, just like the level 4 anima also realizes that no one woman can ever embody its characteristic. You know, a level 1 anima is like, she's my wife and she's mine and she's my one woman forever, and then he puts so much pressure on that and forces her to live out all of these things that she shouldn't do because other women should be playing those roles. You know, a man who's not differentiated in that way is going to expect his woman to play every single role there is, just like a woman's going to over expect that from the man. But when you get to this level 4, you go, oh, there's all different people, and no one person will ever be everything. And this is how Jung could have Emma, his wife, and Tony, his lover, and he could say, Tony, after their deaths, and they died very close to each other right before his death, and he said, Tony was my scent in life, but Emma was my foundation. And he didn't expect Emma to provide his, you know, and they had other lovers too. And, you know, it's like nobody can give everything to everybody, or even to one person, you know. We can't be everything to everyone. Yeah. And we can't even be everything to one person.
And I was just going to say too, I think it's pretty popular sentiment now, and it's super been important for my development to take that pressure off of my partners, of meeting everything in me, and really relying on different communities of men and women and friends, and having to learn the real interpersonal skills to actually do that in a way that is respectful and all of these different things. But yeah, that's just, you know, the one person can never meet everything in you. Yeah. You know,
and so as we develop our sort of image of others, I mean, really, the real answer to the question, we have all these question marks of like, what is it to be like NB and have an anima or animus, or is it animx, or how does it work, or how is it for trans, or really it's who you're attracted to. That is the image of your contrasexual impulse. Mm-hmm. The person that turns you on, you get aroused by them. You get turned on by them. And that's why I'm saying it's so hard to leave behind and sacrifice, because it's really easy for women to get aroused by a guy in a leather jacket who shows strength and power and stoicism. And it's maybe slightly harder, but still pretty easy to get aroused by a romantic poet who's making you cry tears of joy with his beautiful roses and wine. But it's much harder to then be attracted to a guy who's like, you know, getting more, you know, see, they're getting like less attractive to the masses and more like reserved for the select few. But see, you know, and then it takes someone like Jenny to be attracted to someone like me. It's very hard to be. No, it is. It is hard to be. Now, I mean, at some level, I guess you can say we always build on it so that there is a healthy foundation of stoicism when needed, applied stoicism, not default, not unconscious, but when we need to be, we have access to our level 1 animus when we need to show strength.
Yeah,
we have access to level 2 when we need to be romantic.
Well, and it's sort of circumambulation too. You end up going through all of them.
You end up going through it again and
over
again, and I go all the way up, and then I go, actually, all I really want to do is just like get this nice BMW, drive around with like a leather jacket.
Totally.
So anyway,
Totally.
thank you, Teo. We're gonna wrap up for now. Thank you so much. Teo has been absolutely incredible. Thanks to everyone for this. We'll be back in 10 minutes, let's say, for the talk on Steve Rhodes. So I'm really, if anyone has their charts, has their tones, anything at all, please have your chart kind of ready, and we can do some work on like who has tone 1 or 2, who has tone 3 or 4, and like we'll do some crowd work that way. So great, thank you. Back in 10.